welcome to the second lecture in the Cambridge Radical Feminist Network's series, Replatforming Deplatformed Women. My name is Imogen. I'm a PhD student here at Cambridge and founded the Cambridge Radical Feminist Network back in 2018. I'm now just helping out our current co-presidents, Sophie and Phoebe, in administering this great series of lectures that they've organized. We are thrilled to be joined this evening by Jo Phoenix. She is a professor of criminology at the Open University and a trustee for the Center of Crime and Justice Studies. In December 2019, she was due to give a lecture on trans rights and justice at the University of Essex Center of Criminology. Certain students at this university, after hearing that Professor Phoenix had been invited, threatened to disrupt the event to prevent it from going ahead. Just a few hours before the event was to start, the centre announced that the lecture was cancelled due to the fact that they were concerned that open debate and discussion might be obstructed, in their words, by activists. So that brings us here today. The concrete importance of controversies surrounding sex and gender identity is arguably at its most sharp in the context of the criminal justice system. People in prisons are an acutely vulnerable population, both simply by virtue of being incarcerated and therefore at the mercy of the state, not having the freedom to leave or to choose the people with whom they share their day-to-day lives, but also by virtue of their backgrounds, the trauma that they will have experienced in their personal histories, and also that trauma which they are at an ongoing risk of experiencing within prison. This has led to incredibly intense debates over how to deal with matters of sex and gender identity within prison. On the one hand, transgender prisoners who face disproportionate risks of violence need to be protected from that and to be able to live within an environment of safety and of dignity. On the other hand, such prisoners may themselves pose a risk when placed in intimate environments with female prisoners who are by and large physically weaker, and many of whom already have histories of having suffered sexual violence themselves. These debates raise issues, I think we all agree, of profound importance for everyone involved, and it is therefore vital, we think, that these debates be conducted openly, honestly, and robustly. To that end, we are thrilled to hear from Professor Phoenix, who will be presenting her lecture titled Sex, Gender Identity, Prison Placement Policy, and Penal Politics. Following the lecture, there will be time for a Q&A. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can submit your questions during the talk using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screens. Those of you who are watching on YouTube can use the live comment function, and Phoebe will be monitoring that page for questions. Just like last week, we ask that everyone using the Zoom chat just be respectful to each other, and otherwise be aware you might be removed from the Zoom if you don't do that. Lastly, if anyone is experiencing any tech issues, please flag that in the chat, and Mary from Object will PM you and try to help the best that she can. But without further ado, Professor Phoenix, when you are ready.
Thank you. And oh my goodness, what a fantastic introduction. You basically set the scene for me beautifully, beautifully well. Before I start the lecture, or the talk, whatever you want to call this, I just want to say a very special thank you to Cambridge Radical Feminists. Replatforming the Deplatformed is, in my mind, a brilliant idea, and I think that you guys have done a fantastic job. And just the sheer number of people attending, I think, should tell you how much it's needed. So well done. Big congratulations there. And before I go any further, I also want to say it's almost impossible to follow Julie Bindel, right? Completely impossible to follow her. So I'm going to try. And what I want to do in the next little while is really just map some of the terrain that Imogen referred to. Some of this won't be new to a lot of you. I'm not going to dip into anything terribly in depth, except maybe some of the theories that sit underneath it. Some of this may sound a little bit esoteric, and I apologize, it'll pick up as it goes through if you're more interested in the politics. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I hope I do this well. Okay, I'm assuming that the screen is now shared. Yes, great, thank you, Sophie. I apologize for the fact that I actually write with a quill most of the time, so all of this technology is a little bit new to me. What I want to focus on is how ideas shape politics, and then how politics kind of then shape ideas, and how we get into at particular moments in history recurring debates that become simply unresolvable. As Imogen rightly kind of outlined at the very beginning there, this is one of those intractable, unresolvable debates. So we have to end up somewhere in the end with the least worst case scenario almost. Okay, now why hasn't that moved on? There we go, current controversies. All right, well, some of you may know this, but just in case you don't, I'm going to remind us of the history. The issue of trans prisoner placement, so where trans prisoners ought to be placed in the prison estate, came to public attention in 2015, when the then current prison placement policy was called into question following the placement of 2 trans women in the male estate. One petitioned to be moved into the women's prison, then the other was found dead, having told herself that she would kill herself if she was sent to a male prison. Now, at that point, the policy adopted by the Ministry of Justice was that prisoners were placed according to their legal sex, i.e. that which is on their birth certificate and or altered birth certificate following a GRC, but with room for discretion. Now, in November 2016, after these 2 cases, the MOJ published new guidelines. And these new guidelines basically said that it removed the requirement of a prisoner to have a GRC to be placed in the prison opposite to that which they were born, if you follow what I mean, and introduced the basic principle that people who are living in a gender different to that of their assigned birth should, as a general presumption, be treated by the offender management services according to the gender with which they identify. Albeit a decision to be ratified by the prison service, and in light of an assessment balancing the views and well-being of the transgender person in need to ensure the safety and security of other prisoners, the staff, and the environment. In other words, a very British solution, a kind of form of managed self-identification policies. So 2 precipitating events, however, proved to be a catalyst, turning what was at that point a relatively small political, organizational, and academic issue into what has been called one of the most toxic cultural wars of our times, a botched government consultation and a worst case scenario. I say botched because it failed to do the one thing that government consultations ought to do, make an assessment of the impact of the policy changes it was suggesting. It also failed to think through the complexity of what it was asking to consult on. Predominantly, the consultation was about changing various aspects of the process of obtaining a GRC. The aspect of the consultation, however, that proved to be the catalyst for the cultural war, that was twofold. The idea of self-identification and a variety of profoundly different interpretations about what that actually meant, and the impact of this on the Equalities Act provision for the protection of single-sex spaces. With that, the stage was set for a clash of ideologies and slogans between those espousing a trans rights perspective where self-identification became the only platform on which to support trans people's rights, and those espousing a gender critical or feminist perspective in which self-identification was constituted as a threat to the maintenance of sex-based protections in the Equal Act 2010. As the debate escalated, it rapidly spiraled into a binary, mutually exclusive debate about the category woman, what a woman is, who is to be included in it, who is to be excluded in it, and who has the right or power to define the category. All of this is neatly summed up in the slogans that we all know quite well today, the 2 hashtags, trans women or women, and hashtag sex matters. And of relevance here is that the issues of prisoner placement policy became emblematic of the anxieties and the frustrations felt on all sides when, as occasionally happens, the worst case scenario happened, that of Karen White, a trans woman housed in the women's estate who is convicted of attacking 2 women whilst on remand in Newhall Prison. With that, the MOJ moves swiftly to amend and adapt its policies on prisoner placement. Those opposed to the idea of self-identification use this as a cautionary tale. Those for self-identification accuse the media and campaigners of peddling in transphobic fear and images. So before I go on and talk in any depth about that, I need to take a step back because, as Imogen introduced me, I'm a professor of criminology. Criminology is my home discipline. And as a criminologist, it's very difficult to understand these issues or to convey our understanding of these issues unless you have a basic framework of understanding about prisons from within a criminological perspective, if you follow what I mean. So there are, if you like, a few truisms within critical criminology, or at least, yes, as I said, within critical criminology about the prison. One of the truisms is that prison is perhaps the most spectacular failure of criminal justice administration and policy. There is no evidentiary link between crime and imprisonment. If you imprison more, it doesn't necessarily make the crime rate go down, and vice versa. The other thing that we know from 200 years of studies is that prison tends to make bad things worse. And there are very strong links between using prison to discipline the poor, the working class, and the dispossessed. So all in all, there's generally a critical take on the prison within criminology. And very, very few criminologists would argue for keeping people in prison or for making bad situations worse by imprisoning more people. And in fact, for the most part, most critical criminologists would argue for some sort of decarceration or abolition of prisons. And behind all of that, there is usually the recognition that ultimately the purpose of prison is not to address crime, not necessarily to rehabilitate people, but rather to maintain the security and the legitimacy of the institution itself. So with that in mind, there's probably one other orienting thought to have, and that's that prisons are sex segregated and were sex segregated from the very beginning for 2 main reasons: pregnancy in prison and male violence against women. With the issue of pregnancy, you can just imagine if you had mixed sex prisons and you had men and women having sex and having babies, you'd have some problems with that, or you end up with the state having to supply contraception. So you end up in all of these tangles. So it was easier just to make it sex segregated back in the way back. So the next 2 slides are a little bit theoretical. For those of you who aren't academics, I'm not going to apologize for this, but I will try and pull you through some of these deep theories as we go through. For those of you who do come from an academic background, I hope this is an interesting way, at least for me, to put it for you. So along with the trans women or women and sex matters, we've actually got the meeting point of 2 entirely different theoretical frameworks, if you like. And what I want to do over the next 2 slides is show you how the different ideas, particularly around feminist criminology and then around queer criminology, or what might be called lesbian and gay or trans criminology, shapes a set of politics. And then you'll see how they kind of end up in this unresolvable clash. So within criminology, 20th century feminist theory drew a very sharp line of distinction between sex and gender. And we know that. That's part of the debates that we have currently at the moment. It opened up the space, though, in drawing that sharp line of distinction between one's biological sex and then one's gender, being those social rules and norms that are usually ascribed to people because of their biological sex. It opened up the space to think about gender as a rule that relates to the oppression of women as women. How and in what ways masculinities and femininities were linked to sex-based inequalities was what was up for debate via attitudes or ideologies made manifest in discriminatory laws, or via ideologies that supported deep social structures of patriarchy, itself related to the biological differences between men and women. or via a complex interplay of other forms of social structural differentiation, as best evidenced by Angela Y. Davis. Now, I just want to make a little plug there for those of you who are interested in intersectionality. It wasn't Crenshaw who started that work. There was a lot from Angela Davis. In Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Davis writes, there were many pioneers of intersectionality, but I do think it is important to acknowledge an organization that existed in New York in the late 1960s and 70s called the Third World Women's Alliance. That organization published a newspaper entitled Triple Jeopardy. Triple Jeopardy was racism, sexism, and imperialism. Of course, imperialism reflected an international awareness of class issues. Many formations were attempting to bring these together. My own book, Women, Class and Race, was one of the many that were published during that era. So behind the concept of intersectionality is a rich history of struggle, a history of conversations among activists and movement formations. Now, the point of all of this is to say that when we go back into that wellspring of early feminism, 20th century feminism, second wave feminism, whatever we want to call this, the theorizing that was done from roughly the late 1960s and the activism from the late 1960s until about the 1990s, what we see is a concern to map body, self, and subjectivity and try and understand those dimensions of gendered and sexual differences and how that relates to modes of oppression. Now, when we look at the effect that that had on criminology, it constituted a brand new field of inquiry about theories of criminality, victimization, criminalization, law, and jurisprudence, and gendered and sexed discourses and practices of punishment. So not to put too fine a point on it, it underpinned a set of politics that consistently organized around the underprotection of women vis-a-vis male violence, the over-policing of particular categories of women vis-a-vis criminalization and punishment, and the over-determination of criminal justice practices by sexed and gendered discourse. Now, some of this is much of what Julie was talking about, Julie Bindel was talking about last week, and that's the policing and the protection of women from male sexual violence. Now, for the most part, though, this history of feminist theory and feminist criminologies have been reduced or can be reduced to a series of basic claims where we come to the world of criminology, and that's this, that in relation to criminalization, women are doubly deviant and doubly damned. So women are damned for appearing in the criminal justice system where they don't normally, but they are also made sense of according to how they have deviated from their prescribed gender role. In relation to criminality, we also know this, there exists differences in the pathways to crime between men and women, with women's victimization at the hands of men featuring extremely highly in how it is that women end up in prison and in the criminal justice system. We also know that in relation to punishment, there are highly gendered pains of punishment that mean that the same sentence on a man or a woman can have hugely different effects. We just have to look at the difference that short sentences in prisons have on women versus men. For women, they often lose their accommodation and childcare. And I don't mean childcare, I mean the care of their own children. Their children can end up in care. The administration of criminal justice is based on and caters for the notional man, i.e. at its core, criminal justice systems are based on particular ways of making sense of sexed bodies and gendered individuals and of sexual and gendered differences, right? So at its very, very core. Okay, I hope everyone's with me. There's only one more big theory slide to go. So feminist theory was not the only one drawing lines of distinction between sex and gender. The growth of lesbian and gay studies in the late 1920s was also busy doing the same thing, albeit from a slightly different object of knowledge in hand. Studies of sexuality, like those of Gannon and Simon, Mackintosh, Plummer, and even Lord Humphreys or Foucault and Giddens, set the stage for an understanding of sex, in this case being the embodied practices that one has rather than the biological category, and sexualities as socially constructed. And with that, the field was opened up to ask questions about how and in what ways particular sexual practices were constituted as normal or abnormal. Now, as with early feminist theories, the opening of these fields of inquiry took place within a specific theoretical and political context, that of a struggle against the then dominant discourses in which each of these terms, sex, gender, sexualities, were constructed by and within medical scientific theories that sought to relate that which was considered abnormal or immoral through biological, psychological, or criminal justice interventions. Now, in those early theories, the lines of demarcation that were drawn tended to be around sexualities as in an individual's sexual identity, sex as in the bodied practices, gender as in prescribed rules and roles, identities, one's sense of subjectivity, structure and discourse. And what was emphasized in those early studies was fixity and fluidity, an individual's self-identity versus their ascribed identity. And the primary mode of oppression, if you like, was the symbolic and regulatory binary classification system, heterosexual, lesbian, and gay. Now, queer criminology started many years later. It's probably only the last 15 to 20 years that we've seen something called a queer criminology. And queer criminology takes as its object of knowledge the criminalization of queer sexualities. And those of us who remember the 1980s and the 1990s will remember well that much of the campaigns for lesbian and gay people particularly were around decriminalization or against lesbian invisibility. And queer criminology kind of picks up from that and looks at the criminalization and discrimination of queer sexualities in policing, court processes, differential experience of imprisonment, and of working within the criminal justice system. Now, the importance here is that all of this is underpinned rather than by a politics of trying to figure out how to stop the underprotection of women and the underprotection of women and the over-policing of them. Within queer criminologies, the politics is of a constant refusal, a constant transgression, rather than a liberation or emancipation from something. Now, what this slide tries to show you is something very simple. These are unresolvable theoretical contradictions, plain and simple. It's not that one is more right than the other. They are slightly different, but in their differences, they collide in a kind of ever spinning circle. With feminist theory, with sex, gender, sexualities, and justice, the question becomes, who is a woman? With queer theory and its focus on gender, sexualities, identity, and justice, the question becomes, who is the other? And the justice that is fought for, if you like, is the answer to those questions. So within feminist theory, the justice that's fought for is a justice for women, and likewise with queer theory. So at this point, we get to a little bit of a sideline about self-identification and politics. I think it's a little bit naive to assume that self-ID has only been invented with all of the debate about trans rights and balancing them up with women's sex-based rights. In fact, self-identification has sat within the politics of both feminist and queer theories for a long time. So within feminist theories, it's emancipation and liberation from the constraints of gender roles and rules. I remember well, and I don't know how old the people are in the audience or the memories of anyone from the Cambridge Rad Fem, but I remember well the debates of the 1980s and late 70s about practices like shaving your legs, the wearing of makeup, how we expressed our gender roles, if you like, or in fact our refusal to adopt the rules and roles prescribed for us as women became real touch points in politics. Similarly, within queer, you've got the same sort of stress on self-identification, because what is in effect being broken is that link between a body and all of the social attributes of it. It opens that space for people to make claims around self-identification in their politics. So I think we need to rehabilitate and broaden that category, self-identification sometimes. But as we look at criminal justice reforms, and certainly as I've been looking at the debates over the last 3 years or so, self-identification has just become a catch-all bucket in which anything can be thrown. So occasionally it's talked about a legal reform, as in with the GRC. Sometimes it's talked about as a transgressive or emancipatory act, as I just intimated in the previous slide. So it's often attached to accusations that trans identities are not up for debate. Here, self-identification is about an individual's right to express their unique sense of subjective experience of gender in their own unique way. And just another point about the legal reforms there. Some of the stuff in the GRC, or in the consultation about it, really tried to target the importance of displacing pathologization and medical regulation of trans lives. Now, we can contest all of that. That's a matter of politics, but that is one interpretation of self-identification. But there is another variety or interpretation of this, which is the corresponding one, the capacity of the other in symbolic communication to deny or affirm an individual's self-expression or identity. And this sits at the heart where we look at things like Stonewall policy, for instance, in employment places, where we must respect the right of somebody else to identify as they choose and use the pronouns that they adopt. I'll come back to that in a second. Or the latter one, and this is the one I think that gets really itchy and very, very difficult to figure out what to do with, particularly in prisons, is self-identification as an organizational or institutional principle or priority. So that's the demand that organizations and institutions organize and operate around somebody's sense of self. Now, the example that I've often given when I've been allowed to talk about these things is this. Somebody can identify as a giraffe, and I would respect their right to identify as a giraffe, but then to ask their employer to raise all of the roofs in the institution in which they work to help with the high neck of the giraffe is an altogether different thing. And I think that's one of the real challenges where we come to prison placement policy, is that we're asking for an organization to adapt its ways of working, a sex-segregated organization to adapt its ways of working to accommodate an individual's sense of self, which, as we know from a good century worth of psychology and sociology, individual sense of selves is mutable, it changes, it's often related to the context that people are in. Unless, of course, we want to argue for some essential self, which many of us within the social sciences would not want to do. Okay, I don't know how I am for time, but I'm kind of coming to the end here. Some of you may know I was involved in a piece of research in Canada. Canada in 2017 adopted, or 2018, adopted self-identification for the placement of prisoners across the entire prison system. I'm going to leave you guys to read these quotes. I'm not going to read them out, but they kind of sum up how prison officers talked about it. The piece of research asked prison officers about their experiences and asked them about how they dealt with the self-identification placement policy. And what you can see is something very, very simple. They talked about the contradictions between caring for prisoners who are trans and ensuring security and legitimacy of prison regimes. Remember, we go back to the original observation within criminology that prisons are usually about security and legitimacy rather than, or prison regimes are about security and legitimacy first and foremost, rather than necessarily reforming or rehabilitating prisoners. The other thing that you can see from these two quotes is that there's concern with the gray matter. Many of the prison officers that we spoke to had no problem accommodating trans individuals who, to them, that it made sense. So, you know, a male-bodied individual who was trying to become a woman, or a female who was trying to become a man. But where they struggled, the prison officers struggled, was with those gray categories of male-bodied individuals who want to sit somewhere in between, and likewise female-bodied prisoners. So they understood the extremes, if you like, on trans identities, but not the fluidity. And they certainly didn't understand people who lived in a permanent state of erasure. And again, like I said, you can see from these two quotes that there's real concern about how to keep everybody safe, which of course is, you know, one of the primary commandments for prison officers, particularly in Canada. Now, the bottom line from this piece of research is a really simple one. Bodies matter. Bodies matter. And if bodies matter, then sex matters where it comes to prisons. I'm just going to zip through some of this so we can maximize the time for chat. Now, where we come to the UK, or at least England and Wales, we've got a really mixed bag of stuff going on. It's very difficult to make sense of it or to predict where it's going to go. At the moment, we have a judicial review going through court. The population of trans people in prison is potentially unknowable. So let me just talk you through something. If someone has a GRC, so let's say a male-born individual who has transitioned and is in possession of a GRC, they will be placed in the female estate. There will not necessarily be a record of that. That person will be placed through their GRC into the female estate. Arguably, it may be illegal to collect that information because if you look at the Equalities Act, organizations are not allowed to collect that information. So we've got this interesting anomaly that population may be unknown. So when we talk about the trans population that we know about in prison, these are individuals who identify as trans and not necessarily in possession of a GRC and who make themselves known to the Ministry of Justice in one way or another. And we can say of that population that they are mainly men. There are something like, Fair Play for Women have collected the stats on this, but there's something like 30 trans men, i.e. women who identify as male or as men, and there's something in the order of 150 trans women in the prison population. And of course, Fair Play for Women make the case that a high proportion of those who identify as trans have sex offending in their backgrounds. There's a disproportionate number of people who have sex offending in their backgrounds. Let me be very careful in saying this. There are a disproportionate number of trans women in the male estate who have sex offending in their backgrounds. Now, as we currently have it, a multi-agency board decides prison placement policy on a case-by-case basis, which is worth bearing in mind because it means that there aren't any general rules that are necessarily being followed. It is a case-by-case risk assessment, and trans women, i.e. people without a GRC, are placed in E-wing at the moment in the female estate. Now, there's a lot of arguments, and the key argument against the general placing of trans women, particularly in the female estate, is apart from the risk and safety aspect, is actually that the presence of male-bodied individuals within a female prison creates a certain re-traumatizing effect, a triggering effect, because we also know that something like 90% of women in prison have had some form of sexual violence or physical violence at the hands of men in their lives. Yet, the other thing that we know is it's against all manner of rules and conventions around keeping people in isolation in prison. So one of the challenges that we have is we can't create a unit just for an individual, and we can't deny them association. We cannot keep them in isolation. So there are arguments both sides about how to deal with this. I'm not going to come down on, well, I am going to come down on one side, actually. We've got a real problem here. I think that self-identification is probably the worst possible prison placement policy. Because if we were going to take it to its logical extremes, we would not be able to have a prison with more people than one in it anyway, because each of our senses of self and identity are unique by definition. So we've either got to have a prison of one if we go down the route of self-identification, or we've got to have a prison for all. And I think that those are problematic. I think, you know, at best, at the moment, we probably shouldn't have trans women in the female estate. So I would tend to err, as I kind of put here, on the side of bodies versus identities. I think on one hand, we've got identities with bodies. That's a trans position, if you like, whereas a feminist, a gender critical position might be looking at bodies with identities. And the different inflection of those creates quite different ways of understanding stuff. I'm not going to go on to the last slide because I'm going to leave my talk there. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Yes, I welcome any questions, comments. As I said, what I did was more of a route map around the stuff rather than any full-blown argument. Anyway, thank you.
Jo, thank you so much for that really interesting talk. We have received quite a lot of questions, so I'll go through them the best I can, but my apologies to anyone if we're unable to read out what you've submitted. As a just to start us off, I was wondering if you could talk about the concept of dignity and what role this concept, dignity, absent questions of just pure physical safety, what role should that play in deciding where to house a given prisoner? And by that I mean the dignity both of women in saying, for example, they don't want to get changed in front of someone of the opposite sex, and also the dignity of trans women who say the same thing, that they don't want to be housed with male people who they don't consider themselves one of.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'm going to answer in two different ways, and it's going to sound like a classic academic answer. I apologize. But if we go back to the original, if you like, orienting framework, prisons generally take people's dignity away. So the idea of then trying to base a prison placement policy on maximum dignity for the maximum number of people is a little contradictory. So that's, you know, that's one way to look at it. But I'm also going to broaden it and say the real problem, I mean, the real problem we have with the debate around prison placement policy is this. No matter what angle you come at it from, whether it's safety and security, whether it's dignity, whether it, you know, whatever angle, you end up in this zero-sum equation of relative harm. So which population experiences X worse or better? And that, you know, according to that formulation, we ought to then change or amend our prison placement policy. And I think that's wrong. I think that's absolutely wrong, because those you know, relative harm equations are utilitarian to begin with, and you know, they also don't capture the full complexity of it, as though prison is something that we want to be arguing for, and we want to try and create less harm in prison. Prisons are harmful. Yeah.
So just going through some questions in the Zoom Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A rather than the chat. This is a question from Charlie Cole. Are separate wings on male and female estates for trans prisoners a realistic possibility? But would that also allow for the required association with others, or would it end up becoming too isolating for a prison population which is a minority within either estate?
Yeah, that's again, I mean, well, that is in effect what we currently have. We have a separate E wing in the women's estate. We don't have, interestingly, a separate, like the equivalent in the men's estate, because quite frankly, the government wouldn't put female-bodied individuals into the men's estate for obvious and clear reasons. In America, they do something slightly different. In California, they have a trans, a kind of a mixed trans prison. So that's one way that they square it. But we also have to look at the numbers here. There aren't massive numbers of people. And if you look at, I think it was Fair Play for Women's Freedom of Information request. If you look at the placement of, let's just think about trans women for a second. Let's leave trans men to one side. The placement of people across the nation within these prisons is very few, very, very few indeed. So if we were then to create a trans prison or one wing in which all trans women were accommodated, you might be taking individuals from, I don't know, Northumbria and putting them down in Bristol, say if you were going to put the trans unit in Bristol. Well, of course, the challenge we then have, and we know this from the women's estate, is once you dislocate an individual from their family, their support, their lawyers, and so on, you actually end up raising real questions about justice. Now, and that's about 150 people. If we go across to trans men, there doesn't seem to be the same problem with trans men in the female estate, interestingly. And if the number that we think of trans men in the female state is around 30, well, you're going to get an even more distortion of justice because there are so few. So arguably, the real question is this: if we have to balance these different demands and these different situations, the question is, what framework do we use to try and balance them? The point of the judicial review at the moment is trying to use the legal framework. So has the MOJ exercised its right thinking in assessing whether or not the situation warrants using the sex-based the exemption for single-sex provision, and using that to exclude trans women, and then finding out a different way, perhaps a trans women's unit in a male estate. That was a bit of a wandery answer, sorry.
Great, thank you. The next question is a kind of a follow-up, I guess. Someone from, I think this is from YouTube, I'm not sure. They said potential solutions are based on having a stable gender identity. My daughter works in a category B male prison. They have a prisoner who changes their identity several times a day. How can prisons deal with individuals like that?
By having a prison of one. That is precisely the point. I mean, we want to celebrate our ability to express our unique identities. We really do, but it's a really bad organizational policy for that very, very reason.
Another question from the Zoom chat. Where does the requirement for modesty for women in terms of their religious identity or beliefs, for example, religious Muslim or Jewish women, come into the issue of segregating women from male-bodied prisoners? Right. Here's the interesting thing: when you go into a prison, and this is, this is not me hedging the question or trying to avoid it. The entire prison regime is geared towards ensuring security and legitimacy. The needs of the individual come secondary to that one thing, security and legitimacy. You can change the word security
to something else, and you can call it the regime to sustain itself. So where the regime, where prison regimes allow for individual expression, for modesty, for even different diets, that will come secondary to all other things. So yeah, it's one of the problems. I mean, it was one of the things about the Karen White case that I was told this is all anecdotal and it's out of the press and everything else. But one of the things that I was told is that because Karen White was such a big bloke, that the very presence of him in the washing area really put women off, including some of the female prison officers. So yeah.
Okay, I have some more sort of general theoretical questions. Number one, from Carolina, who's a member of the network. Do you think that self-identification is just a facet of a growing culture of individualism, or is it more of a unique issue?
I love that question. The paper that I didn't write and the lecture that I've never given is the one that talks about self-identification as the absolute reification of the individual. I mean, you could only have the quest for self-identification in 21st century contemporary capitalism. If you look at consumer capitalism particularly and its growth, from about the 1980s onwards, when we stopped being societies of producers, where we stopped being the makers of things and we became the consumers of things, the only way that that drive to consume could be sustained is if we constantly created the need for us to express our unique sense of identity. So yeah, do I think that it's a facet of something else? Yeah, it's a facet of, you know, high-blown individualism as it grafts onto capitalism. I don't know if that answers the question. I have written about that elsewhere, by the way, in a book called Alternative Criminologies. I wrote a chapter on sex, sexualities and social control and alternative visions of it. I write about it in that.
A question from YouTube. Quite a few male prisoners have claimed to be women only after they've been convicted, rather than simply coming in already having identified as a member of the opposite sex. Has there been any research on what sort of proportion falls on one side or the other?
No, although there are some statistics, I think, again, they're fair play for women that have them, about the number of people who come out as trans in prison. A little apocryphal story, I don't know if I've used that word right, a little story from Canada. So shortly after I was over there doing some of the research for this that I was talking about, the person who had the research grant, Professor Rose Ricciardelli in Newfoundland, wrote to me and said that they were noticing a new phenomena because it was a longitudinal study that they were involved in. So they were going back to the same prison officers year in, year out, asking them more or less the same set of questions. And prison officers by 2019, so 2 years into the study, started talking about the fact that male prisoners cottoned on to the fact that all they had to do was identify as a woman to get changed into the women's estate. And they started doing that because in their mind, it wasn't so much that they were predatory sex offenders, but the women's estate has, you know, a reputation of being easier, plain and simple, an easier way to do your time. So, I mean, people's individual motives need to be disentangled, if you like, because, you know, no matter what system you have, you're going to have people try and place themselves within it.
So another anonymous question from the Zoom Q&A. Would you recommend prison abolition? I find it hard to believe that the fear of imprisonment doesn't reduce crime. Additionally, we know many male criminals, particularly rapists and pedophiles, cannot be rehabilitated. So is it not the duty of the state to imprison such criminals? A bit of a left turn there, but I don't know if you could give your opinion nonetheless.
Okay, let's see if we can disentangle some of that. there are many different philosophies of punishment, and a little bit like the theories that I outlined here, they are unresolvable. They are just different philosophies of punishment. The one that is being proposed by the questioner is retributivism, and that's the idea that, I mean, it's an old idea, eye for an eye sort of thing, that the punishment, the pain of punishment ought to be commensurate to the pain of the crime. And that will then deter people from committing crime. Deterrence theories don't work. There's only one that does, and that's, or not one theory, but only one deterrence activity that we know has a really high net result, and that's speed cameras, because there is certainty of getting caught with speed cameras. So we know that tends to deter people from speeding. But where it comes to these other crimes, particularly crimes of sexual violence, deterrence doesn't work. Now, does that mean that we should just simply lock people away? No. How do we deal with sexual violence? Very differently than we currently do, because the one place, this is, you know, slightly controversial to say, but it needs to be remembered, the one place that we know is a hotbed for sexual violence is a male prison. It stands to reason if you think about it. So, you know, what do we do when we send men who are sexually violent to prison? We take them out of the circulation, but that's probably all we do. We just take them out of circulation. And, you know, perhaps counterintuitively, sexual violence rehabilitation programs actually have quite a high rate of success in reducing recidivism in comparison to a lot of the other rehabilitation programs. So would I advocate prison abolitionism? I would advocate dealing with crime in the manner that we need to, and that's often dealing with inequalities in social structures rather than necessarily finding warehouses to put people in.
Thank you. Another question from this one from Sophie. She wanted to know what the relationship was from your point of view between your feminism and your research, and to what extent they influence one another. If I could just tack on my own sort of sub-question, what is your opinion on this recent sort of resurgence of the concept of carceral feminism that sometimes feminists are spoken of in disparaging words for wanting, for example, rapists or whoever else to be locked up rather than dealt with in some other way?
So once upon a time ago in a land far, far away called the 1990s, I pitched up at Keele University to be a PhD student to study prostitution. And at that moment in my own personal history, I was a radical lesbian separatist feminist and a firebrand at that. Yeah. However, I was then, and Sophie and I kind of mentioned this a little bit in the before bit, I was then taken into a world where some of my own taken for granted ideas about sex workers and sex workers' lives were really, really challenged and put to the test. So that and an absolutely amazing supervisor, a woman called Professor Pat Carlin, helped me to understand perhaps some of the differences between what we do when we create knowledge and then what we do when we are politicking. So for quite a while, my feminism has been slightly underground. And when I say that, what I mean is I've been more interested in some of the ideas until the thing about self-identity and some of the trans rights ideology. And at that point, I thought, hang on a second, now we're in a place where I can no longer remain as quiet as I used to about politics. And it's because it defies logic. Some of the trans right ideology just defies the logic and the experience that women have. And any set of politics or knowledge that, in my mind, decries or somehow sidelines the violence that women experience at the hands of men just sticks in my throat, because I've spent a lifetime, quite literally 23 years, investigating prostitution and child sexual exploitation, and I know too many stories. So what was the question? What's the relationship between my knowledge production and politics and my feminism. I consider myself a feminist. There are many who wouldn't consider me their type of feminist. But then that's always been the case within feminism. We've been a broad church and we've often fought. Coming to the question of carceral feminism, I have a problem. I mean, it's, you know, I was listening to Julie's talk last week and I really liked the fact that she said, we don't want special laws, we just want the laws being enforced against men who commit violence. It's that thorny dilemma. I mean, if you are a critical criminologist and if you are a feminist criminologist, you recognize one thing. The state has never really represented the interests of women where it comes to justice. You know, women don't have equal access to the law. We don't have equal protection by the law, even now in 2021. We still do not have that. And so if we do not have that, how we can then go to the state to ask for the state to ameliorate the very inequalities that we experience is a real conundrum to me. But then all of the other alternatives that we've got, things like restorative justice and all of that stuff, I just look at it and think, well, that doesn't quite hit it. So maybe we need to go back to the baseline politics and we need to actually figure out different ways of organizing, different ways of finding justice, and actually going back to those ideas about structural oppression and women as a sex class. So I find myself at the tender age of 56, coming back to where I was in the 1990s. Does that answer both of your questions?
Yes, I think so. So I'm just going to ask two more questions as we're almost at 7 o'clock. Another sort of nice general political one from a woman, Fiona English. She asks, I totally agree about the neoliberal characterization of self-identification. So why has it been so successful at taking over certain sections of the left? Is it that liberalism has replaced collectivism as a social movement?
That's a really good question. And I wish that I had left the slide up that I took out. Because the slide that I had up that I took out had to do with sexual politics, as in sexual politics, but it can be broadened. I think that we have an absolute clash of libertarianism. And I think that self-ID, it's not just part of neoliberal, the neoliberal turn, and it's not just part of individualism, it is deeply embedded within libertarianism. And one of the interesting problems is that libertarianism has never done women any favors, ever, you know, at all. So I totally forgot the question. My brain is just beginning to wander all over the place. But yeah, why is it part of the progressive left? Because I think there is a real a wanting to avoid the opposite of libertarianism, which is often seen as being moral authoritarianism. So I think that that call to have some type of regulation or to be agnostic about regulation, you know, is not something that the left wants to do because it wants to be inclusive and include all and allow free expression and that kind of libertarian approach.
Thank you so much. Just for, I notice we're now at 7 o'clock. I'm just going to get the last question to someone at the Open University, just because it seems appropriate. I expressed no opinion on what she's about to say, but I'll just read out the question as she's typed it. Joe, I'm studying criminology with the OU right now. New module and the wording is predominantly gender and not sex, which is madness when assessing causes of harm and crime. The current assessment only allows the use of gender. Any suggestions of what minor or major acts of resistance you can suggest? How can the OU hope to produce useful criminologists if we are not encouraged or allowed to discuss sex?
Well, all I would say, and what a very good student you must be, all I would say is take control of the question. So if the question says assess the harms, then actually say, fine, I will, but I'm going to address sex as well. So, you know, you can insert yourself. Don't treat us at the OU or any of you who are students, don't teach your lectures don't treat your lecturers as though they control your syllabus. We give you stuff. You can be more inquiring and you can take control of it and do interesting things for yourself.
Okay. Well, that just brings us past 7 p.m. So I think we'll call it there. I'll let Jo enjoy the rest of her evening. Thank you so much for joining us for that really interesting talk. And also thank you so much to the audience for tuning in and for giving us your really interesting questions. We deeply appreciated. Finally, let me say again, a massive thanks to Object for letting us use their Zoom platform, and particularly thank you to Mary, who has been giving us tech support behind the scenes this week and also last week. And thank you also to Eve for creating the amazing posters and the graphics that we've been using for this lecture series. We're super grateful to all of those women. Now I'll just pass on to Phoebe, who I think is going to say a word about donations and also what we're going to be expecting next week. Phoebe.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jo. That was a fascinating talk. I certainly learned a lot and really enjoyed it. I once again here to ask if you've got any money, to be a bit cheeky. If you do want to support our work, donate to us and make sure that we can carry on hosting fantastic events like these, especially post-lockdown, and when we can meet in person, which will be amazing. Then our PayPal is in our Twitter bio. Next week we've got the brilliant Maya Forstater talking about why sex matters, and this recording will also be available on our YouTube channel if you've missed anything or you want to clarify anything and to catch up. So yeah, thank you so much, Jo. And
You're very welcome. You're very welcome, and thank you for the invite.
I think, Mary, we're going to leave it there. Feel free to carry on chatting on in the YouTube comments section. But if you want to close down the Zoom, that would be brilliant.